Before the Vietnam War became one of the most defining conflicts of the 20th century, Vietnam was a land of quiet rhythms and deep traditions. Most people lived in rural villages surrounded by rice paddies, their lives tied to the changing seasons and the cycles of planting and harvest. Families worked the land together, shared meals made from what they grew, and passed down customs that had survived for centuries. Life wasn't easy, but it was familiar, shaped more by community and faith than by politics or global powers. Economically, Vietnam was still recovering from decades of colonial influence. The French had built infrastructure for trade, but the profits rarely stayed with local farmers. By the mid-20th century, many Vietnamese dreamed of a fairer life, one where hard work meant stability. Yet beneath the surface, tensions brewed. Ideological divides, international interests, and the struggle for independence would soon tear the country in two. Long before the world came to know Vietnam as a battlefield, it was a land built around its rivers. The Red River in the north and the Mekong in the south were the nation's lifelines, feeding millions and shaping a culture of patience, endurance, and balance. Most Vietnamese families lived in small villages, surrounded by rice paddies, where work began before sunrise and ended only when the mist settled again over the water. Rice was the measure of wealth, time, and effort. Every grain carried the value of a family's labor, their hopes of surviving another season. Under French colonial rule, which began in the late 19th century, life changed, but not always for the better. The French reshaped Vietnam's economy to serve their empire, turning fertile land into vast rice and rubber plantations owned by a few affluent landlords. Vietnamese peasants, however, remained poor, working long hours for little pay. Taxes grew heavier, while profits flowed out of the country. It was an economy that looked modern on paper, but felt deeply unequal in reality. Despite foreign control, local craftsmanship and trade continued to thrive in smaller forms. In the villages, artisans produced lacquerware, silk, and pottery, sold in busy markets, where smells of noodles, spices, and incense mixed in the air. The French built railways and ports, connecting cities like Hanoi, Hue, and Saigon to global trade routes. But these benefits rarely reached the countryside. For most, the only wealth that remained was found in community, in shared meals, ancestral worship, and the rhythm of collective work. Social divides were stark. French officials and educated elites often lived in isolated neighborhoods filled with cafes and colonial villas, while farmers labored in flooded fields nearby. Still, beneath this imbalance was a quiet strength. Vietnamese families clung to their identity, language, and traditions, passing down stories of resistance and pride. Even in hardship, they never stopped believing that the land, though ruled by others, still belonged to them. By the early 1940s, the calm rhythm of Vietnamese life had been shattered. When World War II reached Southeast Asia, Japan occupied Vietnam, pushing aside the weakened French colonial authorities. At first, many Vietnamese saw the Japanese as potential liberators, but that hope quickly turned to despair. The occupiers extracted food and resources to feed their war machine, leaving the countryside stripped and desperate. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in Vietnam's history, a devastating famine in 1945 that claimed the lives of nearly 2 million people. Villages that had once thrived on rice fields were left with nothing but hunger and silence. Yet out of suffering came an awakening. The harsh years of occupation exposed both the cruelty of foreign control and the strength of national pride. Resistance movements began to form, uniting farmers, students, and workers under a common dream: independence. At the heart of this rising tide stood Ho Chi Minh, a revolutionary who saw the famine, the exploitation, and the humiliation of his people as proof that Vietnam must take control of its own destiny. His message, simple and powerful, spread across the country like wildfire. As World War II ended, a power vacuum opened. The French tried to reclaim their colony, but the Vietnamese, hardened by years of hardship, refused to return to submission. The First Indochina War erupted in 1946, dragging the country into yet another period of blood and sacrifice. The economy, already broken, reshaped itself around survival. Families bartered goods instead of money. Villages learned to feed themselves again, and the lines between soldier and civilian blurred. By 1954, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu marked the end of French rule, but not of conflict. The settlement at Geneva divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel, setting the stage for a deeper split between North and South. The North embraced Ho Chi Minh's communist vision, focusing on land reforms and equality, while the South leaned toward Western influence and foreign aid. The seeds of war had been planted, quietly and inevitably, in the soil that had once only known rice and peace. When the guns fell silent in 1954, Vietnam was no longer one nation, it was two. The Geneva Accords divided the country at the 17th parallel. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh and the Communists. The South governed by Ngo Dinh Diem with strong American backing. At first, the line seemed temporary, a political compromise, but as ideology hardened, it became a border that separated families, dreams, and futures. In the North, the new government pushed for sweeping land reforms. Large estates were confiscated, and farms were redistributed to the peasants who had long worked them. For a brief moment, there was hope. Villagers finally held title to their land and a sense of ownership over their harvests. But the policy soon turned severe. Many landowners were publicly denounced, sometimes executed, and fear spread through the countryside. Still, collective farming became the foundation of the northern economy, built on unity, sacrifice, and the promise of equality. Meanwhile, life in the South took a different path. Fueled by American aid and foreign investment, Saigon began to pulse with new energy. Streets filled with cars and neon lights, markets overflowed with imported goods, and Western films played in downtown theaters. The promise of capitalism brought visible prosperity to some, but not to all. As urban elites grew wealthier, rural communities remained mired in poverty. Their crops depended on price fluctuations and corruption. Economic inequality widened, and discontent brewed quietly beneath the surface. Everyday people lived between ideologies they didn't choose. Families were split across the dividing line, brothers on opposite sides of loyalty and belief. In the North, life centered around collective labor and national pride. In the South, it turned toward consumption and foreign support. The two economies reflected two worlds, one built on revolutionary discipline, the other on external dependency. Both were fragile, both unsustainable on their own. And beneath the surface of factories, fields, and policies, the tension of an unfinished war continued to hum in the background, waiting for a spark. By the early 1960s, Vietnam stood at a crossroads between two worlds, one rooted in centuries of tradition, the other swept up in the winds of modernization. Nowhere was this contrast clearer than between Saigon's bright streets and the quiet, rugged villages far beyond the city limits. In Saigon, energy pulsed through the air. Cafes filled with French pastries, jazz music played on vinyl records, and young people flocked to cinemas showing American films. Signs written in both Vietnamese and English advertised new consumer goods, radios, scooters, sewing machines, symbols of a future tied to prosperity and modern living. This wave of urbanization brought hope to some and confusion to others. In the countryside, where most Vietnamese still lived, poverty remained the norm. Farmers worked the same flooded rice fields their ancestors had tended for generations, often relying on outdated tools and unstable markets. The divide between city and village widened with every passing year. For rural families, Saigon's growing glamour was a distant world glimpsed only through traveling merchants and returning soldiers. Cultural identity was also in flux. Western influence, carried through media, education, and American advisors, softened traditional norms, especially among the youth and urban middle class. Fashion shifted rapidly. Women in the South embraced shorter hair, colorful dresses, and modern versions of the ao dai influenced by Western styles. Music blended old folk tunes with the rhythms of jazz and rock, creating a new cultural sound that challenged the conservative past. Women's roles began to change in both regions. In the North, Women were encouraged to join the workforce, study, and even serve in local militias as part of socialist ideals of equality. In the South, Western education opened new paths, though social expectations still tied many women to family duties. Despite their differences, women across Vietnam shared the burden of survival and the quiet power of adaptation. Amid this transformation, Vietnam seemed to be moving forward, but beneath the progress was unrest. The promise of modern life clashed with enduring inequality, and as American involvement deepened, the fragile balance between tradition and change would soon give way to a new stage of conflict. By the mid-1960s, the quiet tension that had long divided North and South Vietnam erupted into full-scale war. What began as a regional conflict became an international firestorm when the United States entered the battlefield in 1965. American troops, resources, and machinery flooded South Vietnam, transforming its cities almost overnight. The economy boomed on the surface, construction surged, imports multiplied, and Saigon's streets filled with bars, hotels, and shops catering to foreign soldiers. Prices rose, fortunes were made, and for a time, it seemed like prosperity had arrived. But beneath the glitter was instability, the kind that vanishes as quickly as it appears. As bombs fell across rural areas and entire villages vanished overnight, survival became a full-time struggle. Families fled their homes with whatever they could carry, forming long lines of refugees heading toward safer regions. Children grew up under the echo of explosions, learning to dig shelters instead of playing in fields. Separation became a painful routine. Husbands went to war, mothers searched for safety, and letters that once took weeks to arrive sometimes never did. In the South, the massive influx of American money distorted the economy. Jobs tied to the military presence, construction, transportation, entertainment, flourished briefly, but local industries suffered. Inflation hit hardest among ordinary people. A new class of war profiteers emerged. Traders who sold goods smuggled from U.S. bases, contractors who built roads to nowhere, and officials who found ways to turn conflict into cash. The black market became a lifeline for many, a symptom of a society living between survival and corruption. Meanwhile, in the North, relentless bombing campaigns known as Operation Rolling Thunder crushed factories, bridges, and villages. Yet, despite destruction, collective spirit held strong. People dug tunnels, rationed food, and carried on work under candlelight, believing endurance was their greatest weapon. By 1968, after years of blood, loss, and disillusionment, Vietnam stood on the edge of exhaustion. The war had created an economic roller coaster. Rapid growth for some, ruin for most. And as the Tet Offensive exploded that year, it became clear that neither bombs nor dollars could restore the life that once existed before the sound of war clouds filled the sky. The year 1968 marked a turning point in the Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive, massive, coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, shocked both sides of the conflict. Streets once filled with markets and chatter turned to ruins and silence. For the Vietnamese people, the offensive was more than a military event. It was a moment when hope and despair collided. Cities like Hue lay in ashes, villages were emptied, and countless families found themselves mourning loved ones lost not in battle, but in the chaos that followed. As the war dragged on, survival became a constant negotiation. Food shortages spread, and ration cards replaced currency in many parts of the country. In the North, people cultivated tiny gardens beside bomb shelters, while in the South, families bartered with whatever they had: rice, soap, even American cigarettes. Children learned to sleep through air raids, women became heads of households, and communities built networks of quiet resistance and care. The scent of burning fields and diesel hung in the air, a reminder that even daily life was a front line. The psychological toll was profound. An entire generation grew up knowing little but conflict. School lessons were interrupted by sirens, weddings postponed by loss, and futures narrowed to survival. Many Vietnamese spoke of living one day at a time, uncertain of what tomorrow would bring. Yet beneath the exhaustion lay quiet resilience. Parents told stories of peace to keep their children's hope alive, even as the world around them shattered. By the early 1970s, both North and South were drained, economically, emotionally, and spiritually. The war that had promised liberation on one side and security on the other had delivered devastation to all. In 1975, as Saigon fell and the long war finally ended, the people of Vietnam stepped into an unknown future. The promise of peace was heavy with ghosts, but within every family's memory was a shared truth. Though the war took much, it had not broken the human spirit that had carried Vietnam through centuries of hardship. When the war finally ended in April 1975, Vietnam celebrated reunification, but the victory came at a staggering cost. Cities like Saigon, Hanoi, and Hue bore deep scars of bombardment, and the countryside lay in ruins. Bridges had crumbled, farmland was poisoned by years of chemical warfare, and millions of families mourned the missing. The war had not only taken lives, it had dismantled the very systems that sustained them. In a newly united Vietnam, the challenge was survival. The government in Hanoi launched ambitious socialist reforms, determined to rebuild the nation from the ground up. Land collectivization became the central policy. Private farms were merged into cooperatives, and production quotas were established to ensure equal distribution. On paper, the system promised fairness. In reality, it strained the population already weary from decades of conflict. Many farmers felt disconnected from the new structures of control, their independence replaced by bureaucracy. Productivity fell, black markets reappeared, and shortages became part of daily life once again. Urban areas faced their own struggles. Factories lacked equipment and raw materials, while trade restrictions and international isolation kept Vietnam's economy stagnant. Life in the cities slowed to a crawl. Ration lines, power cuts, and limited goods became the new normal. Yet amid this hardship, communities quietly rebuilt through cooperation and ingenuity. Families turned courtyards into vegetable gardens, neighbors shared food, and artisans revived traditional crafts as a means to survive. For many, the dream of peace turned into an exodus. In the late 1970s, tens of thousands of Vietnamese fled by sea in overcrowded boats, seeking refuge in Malaysia, Thailand, and beyond. They became known as the Boat People, symbols of both tragedy and the unbreakable will to find freedom. Each family that left carried not only fear, but the memory of the land they loved and lost. Vietnam's reconstruction was slow, painful, and often uncertain. Still, through resilience and adaptation, the nation endured. The scars of war remained visible in fields and hearts alike. But so too did the quiet determination to move forward. A familiar rhythm in a land that had survived everything. As the decades passed, Vietnam's story became one of remarkable transformation. The same spirit that had carried its people through centuries of hardship now guided them toward rebuilding. The habits of endurance, community, and adaptability, rooted in the pre-war village life, became the foundation of recovery. Where once survival meant harvesting a modest rice yield or repairing a damaged roof, it now meant learning to navigate a changing world and a modern economy. In the 1980s, the country began to shift direction. The policy known as Doi Moi, or renovation, opened Vietnam's doors to market reforms and foreign trade. Farmers regained control of their land, small businesses re-emerged, and investments started flowing in. The slow return of prosperity was not built on sudden wealth, but on the quiet discipline that had always defined Vietnamese life. From the ruins of war came a nation determined to thrive, not just survive. Today, Vietnam stands as one of Asia's fastest-growing economies, a hub of trade, manufacturing, and culture. Cities like Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi hum with energy, their skylines rising where bomb craters once scarred the land. Yet even as the country modernizes, the echoes of the past remain close. In the countryside, Sunday markets still resemble those of 100 years ago, filled with laughter, bargaining, and the scent of freshly steamed rice. The nation's progress has not erased its identity, it has deepened it. Culturally, Vietnam's endurance is a legacy of balance. The people have learned to embrace modernity without abandoning their traditions, to celebrate growth without forgetting the cost of freedom. The lessons of war are written not just in history books but in every gesture of generosity, every rebuilt home, and every song that remembers the fallen. From colonial hardship to global participation, Vietnam's path has never been straight, but always forward. Its legacy is not defined by conflict, but by the quiet persistence that turns struggle into strength. The world often remembers Vietnam for its war. The Vietnamese remember it for their survival, and for the peace they built afterward. Even in one of history's darkest conflicts, the Vietnam War produced surprising stories. Economic, social, and technological transformations that few people ever hear about. Beneath the headlines of politics and battlefields, everyday life in wartime Vietnam was full of human ingenuity, adaptation, and unexpected links between cultures. One little-known fact is how powerful local bartering systems became. When money lost value and goods ran short, entire communities turned to trade fueled by necessity. Rice exchanged for soap, fish swapped for fabric, and cigarettes used as currency. These spontaneous markets often operated under the radar of military control, keeping families fed and communities connected when the formal economy collapsed. The war also created a strange kind of cross-cultural trade between U.S. soldiers and Vietnamese locals. GIs stationed in South Vietnam often bartered food, uniforms, or even music records for handmade crafts, fresh produce, and local liquor. In some areas, an informal network formed where American goods, wristwatches, chocolate, canned meals, became rare currency. These exchanges, though unofficial, bridged two worlds otherwise separated by language and ideology. Another unexpected outcome was the rapid growth of technology and medicine. To treat battlefield injuries and tropical diseases, medical teams developed new techniques that later shaped emergency medicine worldwide. Helicopter evacuations, portable surgical units, and improved burn treatments all became standard after proving vital in Vietnam. Even modern prosthetics benefited from innovations born in the war's aftermath. Economically and scientifically, Vietnam became a testing ground for change. Some tragic, some transformative. While destruction dominated daily life, resilience and creativity quietly flourished in its shadow. The war's human cost will never be forgotten, but its hidden legacies, resourcefulness, innovation, and cultural exchange, remain part of how Vietnam and the world evolved beyond the conflict.